This is net worth in the United States by age bracket, 10-year age bracket. As you get older, you get better at your job, you get raises, you start businesses, maybe you run a farm, you just get richer. But the real magic happens at age 50, because that's when your single largest expense, your last kid, leaves home and is someone else's problem. A lot of people just turn 50, huh? All right. And then with that extra money, you pay down your second biggest expense, which is typically your mortgage. And by 55, on average, that's paid down to zero. So that last decade, 55 to 64, the last decade that you're working is the wealthiest you will ever be. And the capital that you generate in that decade of your life is what drives the entire global system. It is literally where the money is. That is 70% of global private capital. Now you turn 65 and that changes. If there's a currency crash or a market crash, you won't have the income to recover. So you have to liquidate your holdings and go from, say, stocks and bonds to T-bills and cash. Perfectly normal. Everybody does it. And normally it doesn't matter because normally we have a demographic structure that looks like this. It's a standard pyramid. Children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Nigeria. Nearly pre-industrial. And normally, when you turn 65 in a system like this, it doesn't matter because there's more people 64 below and 63 below that. And the proportion has more or less held in this shape for the entirety of human history until 1945, because that's when the Americans changed the way the world worked. At the end of the war, we found ourselves facing down Stalin and the Red Army. We're like, oh, we're going to need some help with this one. And so we did the most reliable thing we could to build up an alliance. We bought it. We created globalization. We used our Navy to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and interface in any market with any partner. And that changed the way national economics worked. Pre-1945, if you had food, oil, coal, and iron ore, you could industrialize and develop and expand. But if you lacked any of those, you were probably a colony. 1945 and globalization changed that. Now anyone can go and trade for anything, so you only need one of the four. You can trade for the others. So at different paces, from different starting points, we all started down the path towards industrialization. And when you industrialize, family economics changes because you move off of the farm and into the city to take the industrial jobs. On the farm, kids are free labor. You have as many as you can. Free is great, but in an urban condo, kids are really expensive, really loud, really annoying, really dirty habits. And adults aren't dumb, so we had fewer of them. And 70 years on, we changed from this to this. Suddenly it matters if you turn 65. Baby boomers are the largest generation we've ever had. They're retiring. In fact, in the fourth quarter of last year, we hit the midpoint. Half of them have already retired. And they've liquidated their stocks and their bonds, and they've gone into T-bills and cash, and the velocity of money has already gone into screeching reverse. We've known that this has been coming since the last baby boomer was born in 1966. Are you ready? Nobody is. That means that between January of 2021 and December of this year, the cost of capital always had to go up by at least a factor of 5 in the United States. We're about halfway through that transition. There's a long way to go. And this is independent of anything the Federal Reserve does. The fact that we're struggling with a potentially turning economy, business cycle, inflation, that's just bad luck. There's also a workforce issue here. Boomers, largest generation ever. The Zoomers are the smallest generation ever. Last calendar year, the difference between the exiting boomers and the entering Zoomers was 400,000 worker shortage. That figure will increase each and every year until 2034, when it will peak at 900,000. How do I know this? All the Zoomers are already here. We already know the precise inflow into the workforce for the next 20 years. Is that bad? Yeah. but it is so much worse. Now, those blue arrows on the U.S. one, those are pointing towards the millennials, and they are the people who will save us all. Literally just threw up in my mouth a little bit. The baby boomers are right now in their 20s and their 30s. They're at the peak of their consumption, and that consumption is driving our economy right now. If it wasn't for millennial consumption since 2007, we would have already had at least 3 recessions. In addition, in 10 years, the oldest millennials will be in their 50s. I don't know about you, but I cannot wait to see the millennials having midlife crises. But that means they're going to be entering that capital-rich period of their life, replacing the boomers as the source of capital. Gen X is just too small. And perhaps even more importantly, the millennials, late start, are finally having kids in number, which means in 20 years, their kids will start entering the labor force in numbers. All we have to do to get back to 2019 capital and labor environment is wait 10 years for finance and 20 years for labor. That's it. We just have to wait 10 years. But check out Germany. Bottom fell out of the birth rate 70 years ago. They ran out of kids 30 years ago. And this decade, that big bulge moves into mass retirement. The German economic model was always going to collapse this decade. The Ukraine war is just speeding it up. And then there's China. That is already the fastest aging workforce on record in human history. And we now know that that data is wrong. A little over a year ago, the Chinese admitted publicly that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people. With all of the missing millions, people who would have been born under the one-child system, meaning that they're all 40 and under, suggesting that these yellow bars, those yellow bars don't even exist. We don't have an economic model. Humans don't have an economic model for how that might work in the year 2030. This is China's last decade, period. I could give you a half a dozen other reasons why China's in collapse, but this is the one that is completely unavoidable. There is no policy that can be adopted by any combination of countries that can save them from this.
What China has achieved since the year 2000 really is impressive. They have increased their GDP by a factor of 4 to 5 based on who's doing the math. Now, we all have heard the stories of Chinese statistics and how they're questionable, but let's assume that that 4 to 5 factor is off by 20 or 30%. That's still a really good growth story.
Yeah.
But it was a one-way trip. 2 problems here. Number one, it was not paid for with trade or with consumption. It was paid for with debt. And China's debt today, compared to where it was in the year 2000, is 34 times what it was. So yes, their economy may be increased by a factor of 5, but their debt is increased by a factor of 34. To put this in European terms, imagine Greece if Greece had spent 5 times as much. That's China. That's not sustainable. And that is the story of Chinese economic development. It's not exports, it's debt. So that's kind of piece one. Piece two, they, like Germany, had a moment in time. One of the reasons that the German economy has done so well, especially since 1990, is the birth rate fell out back in the 70s. And so by the time you got to 1990, you had a lot of people who were 20 and older and very few children. And so for the next 30 years, 25 years, you had a lot of people in that 20-year-old to 45-year-old group, and eventually they aged into the 40 to the 65-year-old group. And that is where most economic activity happens. The younger group does the consuming, the older group does the production. And Germany was able to basically experience a double boom as a result. China has done the same thing. The one-child policy plus rapid urbanization gutted the younger generation. And so from 2000 until now, they've had a lot of adults and very few children. The problem we're facing now in China is that they have aged well past the point of no return. So this is the last generation that will see economic growth in China. In addition, the Chinese are now starting to grudgingly admit that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of the missing millions under age 40. So China was aging very rapidly, much more rapidly than Germany, but it was still younger than Germany until the data revisions. And now it's significantly older. And this is the last decade for the German economic model because of aging, which means this is probably the last decade for the Chinese economic model as well. And while Germany focuses on quality and precision in education, China focuses on price. And that's not viable. They've already seen the cost of their labor go up by a factor of, I believe we're up to 16 now since the year 2000. They're no longer the low-cost provider. And with the labor basically dying on its feet, they never can be. They didn't get skilled enough to even attempt the sort of challenge that's in front of Germany. And that, of course, assumes that the Americans decide to try to help, which I find unlikely. The Chinese Navy is short range. They can't project more than about 1,500 kilometers from the coast, and even that assumes it's not wartime. If the ships actually have to dodge and weave, it's less than half that range. That's enough for Taiwan. It's not enough for anything else. And if there was a military conflict, a number of countries with naval assets, the Philippines, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United States, would it be able to shut off the trade and energy arteries that allow China to be a modern industrialized power, with electricity? So shutting China down in a war scenario is really easy. And Xi knew all this a few years ago. But in the last few years, he has so purged the system that no one's telling him anything. So it's entirely possible that he's now believing the propaganda that a Taiwan war could be encapsulated, that no one will intervene, that it'll be easy, and the rest of the world will just suck it up and move on. Our experience with Ukraine is that none of that is true, but it is possible in a propaganda world that maybe he does believe it. I find it unlikely that he has descended into idiotic narcissism with that speed. But this isn't Putin. Putin still has an inner circle. We still bug his phone and read his faxes. Xi has no one. And you can't bug someone's brain. Aside from supplying weapons components and maybe even some weapons, there's really nothing that the Chinese can do to help. The front where it matters is just way too far away. And the Russians and the Chinese, it's always been a relationship of convenience. Not that it's insignificant, but both of them have always felt that if they thought they could get a real deal with the United States, they would drop the other one in a heartbeat. I don't think that's changed. But even if the Russians are facing a complete collapse, I don't think the Chinese are going to get meaningfully involved.
Yeah.
They know in a world where they actively intervene is one where they go to public enemy number one in the United States. And they know what that means. The Russian system does not require an open globalized system to survive. It doesn't require economic growth to survive. China does. Its population is much more restive, and it's much more dependent upon the outside world simply to feed itself. Russia is a massive food exporter. So the Russians can eat a lot of privation and continue. The Chinese cannot. They just die. So the Chinese are always going to look for a way to have their cake and eat it too. And that's exactly what they've been doing. But if Russia were to collapse tomorrow, what we would probably see is the Chinese basically ask around to Japan and the United States, like, hey, do you mind if we go in and take some bits of this? We are at a point where I don't think even if the United States wanted to rescue the Chinese that we could. I think the problem is too far advanced. I mean, we're nearing a situation in the United States strategically where, for primarily demographic reasons, the United States is going to have to make up a list of countries that we want to support moving forward. And it's very likely that Germany is going to be on that list. So you're looking at something on the scale of a Marshall Plan happening every year for the United States to sustain countries that it finds to be strategically important. We can choose to try to help China or try to help everyone else on our list. And the only way we would decide to try to help China would be if they basically did a strategic surrender. And even then, I think it's beyond America's capacity. Obama was one of the least consequential, worst presidents we've ever had, because for 8 years, he didn't leave the Oval Office. He didn't have a conversation with anyone, even his own allies. The reason everyone in Europe loves Obama is because he never called or showed up. Since the Cold War ended, I'd say probably Bill Clinton was our least bad president, and W is our second least bad, and we've just got progressively worse until Trump. Biden is probably in the same quality level of George W. Bush overall, I'd say, which, is not great, but he's better than the last two. The reason I think he's a shoo-in is Donald Trump is a great campaigner within the American right. And he will absolutely be the nominee. There is no one who can challenge him because there are so many people who are his staunch supporters who will vote for him in the primaries, no matter who else is in and no matter what Donald Trump does. So he's a lock to be the candidate. So is Biden. Biden is an incumbent president. They're not going to let Bernie Sanders run as a Democrat again, and the Democratic Party has already closed ranks to prevent a primary fight from even happening.